Welcome to the Lean AI podcast, where we're flipping the AI conversation on its head by focusing on holistic strategies and tactics that drive AI adoption, rather than focusing solely on overcoming the technical challenges of AI. In every Season 1 episode of the Lean AI podcast, we talk with corporate AI leaders just like you, who've uncovered secrets of driving successful AI adoption with far less wasted time and investment. Our guests challenge established views and offer disruptive perspectives, providing new actionable insights. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Lean AI podcast. Today, I'm really excited to talk with Meeta Vouk. Meeta is a seasoned AI executive. She spent 14 years in various key roles at IBM. And today, she is the VP of Product Management, AI, and Analytics at Teradata. In her past, Meeta was also an adjunct professor at North Carolina State University. And as you're about to see for yourself, that really comes through in the way she's able to explain complex topics in a very clear and impactful manner. Well, Meeta, thank you so much for being on the show. We're excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So you and I have caught up, extensively before this, but could you maybe, for our listeners, give a sense of some of the different companies you've worked at and in what roles in the AI space?
I'm a chip designer by training. I've done ASIC design for the longest time. I'm an adjunct professor at North Carolina State University. I taught for 12 years. But in parallel to that, I was at IBM for a very long time. And now I'm at a company called Teradata. At IBM, was working in AI in a couple of different ways. I ran IBM research in Singapore for a little bit, and we were delivering applied AI with different projects, right? So we did a massive project with the government of Singapore. And then I ran portfolios where we were infusing AI into our products. I managed product management for AI for IBM Z Systems for about 3.5 years. And at the moment, I am the VP of Product Management for AI and Analytics at Teradata. My experiences, in productizing AI for enterprise customers has shaped my point of view about this. But whatever I say today is just my thoughts, doesn't represent any company.
Amazing experience. And can't wait for you to share some of the stories that you've already shared with me beforehand. So let's set the scene, right? Right now, this podcast is for corporate AI executives. And right now, if you're a corporate AI executive, it's kind of an exciting time. It's also a little daunting, right? So maybe if you can set the scene for what it feels like to be a corporate AI executive right now, both for yourself and also for the people that you've worked with in your network.
I really think it's a very exciting time. Very rarely in history do you have the perfect alignment of stars to be able to deliver something exciting and to see the outcome of that. So I think, people will use different terms to describe this, Internet 3.0, 2.0. But I do think we are at that moment where AI will redefine not just the enterprise, but society and humanity as well. It's extremely exciting. It's extremely fast-paced. The innovation is coming at a dizzying pace, right? Keeping up with that innovation on what's happening and how should we understand and decide and deliver value is daunting. But I think if we all take a breath and come up with a long-term strategic planning and thinking around this, it's just, it's fun. It's super exciting, I believe.
It is. And then, you open up your favorite website or trade journal or whatever it is, and you see posts about 80% of AI initiatives fail. And AI adoption is a lot lower than we thought it would be at a certain company or in a certain industry. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And, it depends on the industry we talk about from an AI adoption perspective. We will always see the gamut of people being in different phases of their adoption journey. So some are leaders, some are followers. We've seen adoption around chatbots, around co-pilots, right? That reality has happened. And in my mind, when I think of this as a spiral, the AI adoption, and outside the spiral was AI-powered chatbots, the ability to understand context, the ability to understand language, co-pilots assisting you in the tasks that you do. And we're quickly moving into some very interesting and complex use cases. And at the heart of that spiral is just absolutely mission-critical workloads. When we put AI in them, we can't mess them up, right? They're regulated. They're your financial transactions. They're things like money laundering. You want to be able to bring AI to those use cases, unlock value from that, but you have to reduce the false positive and the false negative. We have to make sure that the AI that we are delivering is not doing the wrong things, is trusted. And I think we will continue to see the pace of adoption really accelerate next year. because everybody's gotten primed up. We have all the technologies available in a consumable fashion now. And, a lot of customers are doing their POCs. And sometimes when you don't have a governance framework defined, your project can fail. But they're starting to define the governance framework. So I think we're at a very interesting point where we will see adoption just take off next year.
That's a great segue, I guess. I don't know where the number comes from, but you see these, whether it's 70% or 60% or 85% of AI initiatives fail. What are some of the mistakes or the don't do's that you've seen out there that you would advise your fellow corporate AI executives to just, avoid that pitfall?
I think we should just all back off from the hype cycle of AI a little bit. One, look at the problem you're trying to solve. I don't believe in AI for AI's sake. Look at the problem that you're trying to solve and who needs to be involved. Bunch of data scientists, playing around with things is good, but just absolutely have to get lines of businesses involved if we are going to productize AI. Productizing AI is hard. It takes tremendous amount of effort. So I think starting with the idea, getting the right people involved, and defining your framework on what are you going to use, what models are you going to use, what regulations apply to you, how are you going to manage the life cycle of AI? Do you need a human in the loop? Do you have AI explainability available to you that actually can deliver on those? So if you look at these well-defined things that you absolutely need to do to productize AI, I think starting with the end in mind and starting with the problem is absolutely key. Then you work with what models do I need to use? Is it cloud hosted? Is it on-prem? What infrastructure do I need to do, etc. And, just also do I have the right skills as well? There is a shortage of skills in the industry around that. But I think starting with the problem and with an end in mind is a good way to start so that your projects don't fail.
When you say starting with the end in mind or starting with the problem, that is a theme that is out there. Could you give our audience an example specifically of what that means or some steps to take? Because I think we've heard a lot of people say, both online and even a few on this podcast, right? Hey, let's start with the end in mind. Let's start with the problem. Maybe let's take this opportunity to go deep on next steps, like tangible, like how do you start with the problem?
You have to bring the right people in the room. And that's where we saw a lot of success in my various roles. Once we got the right people in the room, sometimes the lines of business might not understand what AI can do. They've read a little bit, but they definitely know the problems they face from day to day. There are some problems that are well articulated, like hyper-personalization. Everybody wants to do it. They know they can get a pretty significant sales uplift if they do it. But if you're talking to financial institutions, for example, they'll say, oh, I have a problem with fraud, or I have a problem with money laundering, or I have a problem with clearing and settlement. Can AI help with that? I'm bleeding money. I'm losing, hundreds of millions of dollars every year to fraud. I'm losing hundreds and millions of dollars to money laundering. TD Bank was, I think, $3 billion fine. I think it came out in the news, So it's not small, it's not loose change we are talking about. It's impactful things. But having the lines of businesses sometimes identify the problem and then saying, yeah, we can solve that. You have welding issues. You want AI in your manufacturing process. We can solve that. You want to design a car better? We can help with that. You want your teams to race better? We can help with that. You want to play tennis better? We can help with that. So it's identifying the problem. I want to do this better.
Got it. So in starting with the end in mind, identifying the problem, it's go out to the actual business units, the actual lines of business and say, what are the issues that you're facing these days? What are the challenges? And then as a kind of an entrepreneurial AI team, we can say, okay, how might we solve that with AI?
And you have to also understand what regulations are going to apply to me. Regulations are coming fast. So understanding that regulation landscape as well to say, and just saying, what are my ethics? What are the values of my company? And planting those values to say, yes, we are not going to build on use cases that are going to be detrimental to humanity. We are not going to build use cases where we can't explain the results. It would be terrible if we let AI make loan decisions without explaining why a particular decision was made. And then looking at technologies and technology providers where you can actually get that. Not just, oh, there's a llama, a gazillion parameters out there. Use that. It's use the right model, but do you have all the other things available to you as well? And are the regulators okay with that model? Models are coming from all over the world. The AI Act says you have to explain how they were trained on. Not every model does that. So are you using the one that your regulators would be happy to bless?
So Meeta, let's do a deep dive. I really like what you said about starting with the problem. So you go to a business unit and say, what are the challenges that you're having? And then how might we solve that with AI? Can you give our listeners just the real playbook or the tactics? Is it a workshop? Is it interviews? How do you extract those challenges from a business unit? So then you can ask, how do we solve it with AI?
And I think the majority of every customer you go to, you will have different, you'll find them at different maturity levels. So based on that, it's really the process of a discovery workshop where you're bringing design thinking, and we did this. We brought design thinking, lines of businesses, data scientists, and the infrastructure people in the same room. And we said, okay, list out your problems. And we said, yeah, data scientists, can you solve for it? And infrastructure, can you support it? Here are the tools available to you to solve for that problem. And what's our goal to solve for it? And we would spend a day, 2 days, Ben, and we would come out with 10 use cases. And then we would prioritize them. And, design thinking really helped us in that process because we started with the why, we started with the problem. And once we had that prioritized list of use cases, that's we would get the teams rolling on building out a POC. Once the POC had matured, we would move to a pilot. Then we would make sure that the pilot was production ready. And then moving into production. And for some of these extremely regulated use cases, the keys to AI production is held by the lawyers and the regulatory ops people and the regulators, right? So just making sure that we were having conversations with them along the way as well, so that they understood what we were doing, they understood the risks, and the risks were acceptable to them. It's a repeatable, successful pattern that, most people can implement, yeah?
That's great. So I'm going to repeat that back and you can tell me where I'm getting it wrong. So first thing is discovery workshop with a line of business, with a business unit where you're bringing in, design thinking, the actual leadership of the business unit, and also data scientists and others that are needed to say, how could we address that? How might we address that with AI? Then you've come out of that with a list of use cases, and then you prioritize those, and then you do some testing and iterating through POCs. So next question then would be, if you start with 10, do you always end with 10? Or do you weed out some of the weaker use cases along the way?
The priorities change. So what we noticed was once you get one AI use case in production, they're hungry for more. But then the second one is much faster. It's like falling dominoes. The dominoes might change, right? Because we might say, oh, if I can do this, I think we should reprioritize this one. And there's a special need in this one, or we discovered more while we were on this journey of of doing 10 use cases, right? But it's start with one or two, and we've seen it. It's snowball effect.
Those early proof points are so important. And I think one of the issues that we've seen at Lean Startup Company is when you've got an AI group or an innovation group or even mobility or electrification or whatever it is, only focusing on things that are so far out that it's going to take a long time to deliver that early success or proof point. Sometimes companies lose patience and they say, look, we can't wait this long for results. So I love the getting success stories out there as quickly as possible. And then that builds the snowball effect and kind of extends the runway, in this case of the AI program.
There is a lot of fear of missing out. And if we don't think about these things sustainably and we get caught in the hype, we're not going to deliver value. All these great things that are coming are fantastic, but does it solve for my use case? So I always say fit for purpose AI. Machine learning, deep learning is still going to deliver value. Yes, Gen AI is very cool and it can do amazing things, but it's really the two working together in ensemble architecture. And I think this idea of treating something as a hammer and everything else as a nail, I think leads to failure as well, right? It's just really, how do I solve this particular problem? What's the best way of solving this problem?
So we've talked about some of the to-dos and some of the don'ts. Are there any other drivers of failure that you're seeing out there before we get into maybe more of a comprehensive list on what to do?
Regulations is a big one, Ben. If you don't honor the regulations that are coming or that are already here, I think that's just going to prevent you from going into production. So I can't emphasize on that enough. We are seeing some very interesting things happen with the power requirements of AI. So another recommendation I would have is think about how you can build this sustainably if you can. Because I don't know if you saw the news a few days ago, Microsoft bought 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor. They're opening up because AI is power hungry. Every time you ask ChatGPT a couple of questions, it drinks a glass of water. The water consumption of most big data centers up by 30% to solve for AI needs. And are we driving that just by asking ChatGPT questions? Or are we driving it really to deliver value? I think keeping an eye on just what's going on. And if you're in the growth countries, power is a big thing. Power on envelope. There's a new data regulation that's come that says our data can't leave the country. That's going to affect the world's population. So if you have that requirement, and you don't have a cloud provider, what's your strategy then? So I think these are things that somebody needs to think through, and defining your governance, AI governance framework, where you look at your policies, your procedures, what is important to your company, what are the values you're going to deliver by, is just absolutely key.
I love that. That was one of the things we wanted to talk about. So let's dive into governance. When I talk to different companies about governance, especially in the AI space, there's almost as many definitions of governance as there are companies. From your perspective, what are the most critical aspects of governance? Maybe not just data, but just holistically as well.
I really look at governance from two lenses. One is just governing your AI once, you've deployed it. But before that, it's just defining your governance framework of how are you going to create your organization? How are you going to get the skills that your organization needs? What's going to be the approval process? And it varies. If you're a large retailer, your governance framework is going to look very different versus a large bank versus the healthcare industry. But it's going to look at answering some similar questions. It's how are you going to get organized? What problems are you going to solve? How are you going to go through prioritization or voting of what happens? Who's going to approve these models? How do you understand the risks? Who's going to sign off on those risks, right? So what's your approval process around that? For financial institutions, you have to get approval from your model risk management systems, right? Just do you sign off on this risk or not? Defining that governance framework. And it started ad hoc when people started implementing AI. They were like, oh, I need to talk to this larger group within my organization and I need to find the skills. But it's becoming more prescriptive now. They're saying, no, we need to define a framework around this. And it's evolving. It's evolving now. Different customers, different institutions are at different phases in their journey. But defining that is absolutely key. The governance framework should say, is your policy sustainable or not? What are the data governance issues you're going to run into? Who's going to manage the life cycle of these models? How quickly do you need to check on these? Do you need synthetic data sets or do you not use synthetic data sets? I think defining all of those is great. And defining your value with AI. Do no harm. Good one, right? Do not discriminate, eliminate bias, right? These are my values for AI. So once you define, what that looked like, how are you systemizing this? We get into really governing your AI frameworks. Once AI is in action, can I do data lineage? Can I do data governance? Can I do AI governance, model explainability, bias mitigation? Data is biased because our society is biased. So can I actually make AI less biased? Can I mitigate bias? Can I remove hate and profanity? And what tools are available to me to be able to do that? I think those are important things that absolutely need to be defined.
Couldn't agree more. And I was down at a conference recently, and an AI conference, and a lot of the governance there was good, right? The talk about governance was more around how do you govern your data and how do you make sure the data is managed in the right manner and, with privacy and security and everything like that. I think what you're bringing to light here is there's a much broader definition of governance, which is, do we know where we're going? What's the vision? Do we have a strategy for getting there? Do we have values? Which I love. It's almost like setting up a company. What's our vision? What's our strategy? What are our values? And then we can come up with a portfolio of initiatives that roll up to that strategy. And there's checks and balances along the way. Like you said, the life cycle. Who does the work? Who gets to sign off? How does all that work? So I love what you're saying.
And like how you said it, it's like starting a company. It's exactly that. You're writing down your values, you're planting your values, and you're executing against them.
It's like starting a startup within an existing company.
Most AI initiatives are that. They feel like that.
And I guess I'm finding that the AI team at a company that's working on a portfolio of initiatives, they feel like a startup. They're the ones that need to have the vision that's attached to the overall company strategy and the values and the strategy. And in a lot of cases, that strategy that the AI organization is working on, however you want to define it, is really helpful because somebody says, hey, I've got an AI idea, but it doesn't meet the strategic filter. And so the team says, I'm sorry, we can't. That's not in scope for us. We can't work on it.
That brings up an interesting thought in my head, and I really think we need to bring people along. I personally don't like hard language when I'm talking about AI because it makes certain people feel left out and they might have the most brilliant idea how to solve a problem. Think about the person who's dealing every day with fraud and might not know what AI, has read about the hype cycles of AI, but doesn't know that their capability is just in AI, that you can actually use Gen AI to look at the text against a transaction and use machine learning and deep learning to say what's happening and implement. The person who's running a money laundering process might not understand. You can use Gen AI to understand who has negative news, right? You can look at social media accounts of these people to see what they're talking about. And you can use graph neural networks to figure out how many hops this money has made. But they might be very good at articulating what the problem is, what the challenges are. I think roughly the world lost $3 trillion to money laundering activities last year. So I really think bringing everyone along, because people again and they are on a journey of understanding AI as well. That's where we will deliver really differentiated value.
So far, we've talked about some really good stuff. We've talked about, starting with the problem and the end in mind. We've talked about the need to pull in the business units because in a way, they're the customers. So if the business units aren't aligned and you're not solving a problem for them, they're most likely not going to adopt any AI solution that we could provide. So we've talked about discovery workshops, prioritizing use cases, and then doing POCs. I think that's solid gold for our listeners. We've talked about the need for establishing proof points. We've talked about governance. So coming full-fledged into the what to do, what are the recommendations you would give to fellow corporate AI executives? Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you feel is absolutely critical for them to keep in mind?
I think identifying the right skills. There's a skills war going on in AI industry. People are getting unheard salaries. And it's not the salaries, but the skill is rare. That's why there's a war for AI talent. Getting people's skill up is absolutely key, whether they're product managers, whether they're developers, whether they're data scientists. I think, our education system, in my mind, Ben, doesn't support a comprehensive view of life. So let me explain. I wish our data scientists and our data engineers or our engineers studied philosophy, studied ethics, and that would shape and define their thinking on what they're implementing. And I think that bringing that cohesive group of people together, defining what was your AI product management structure look like. Do you have a person just focused on governance? Defining what that skilled pool looks like. And I think immersing everybody around just the values of what you're doing as well, because I think AI is a very challenging technology. It will change life and humanity as we know it. We have to be so responsible towards it. I think let engineers lose on a problem, we'll build an atom bomb. I think just understanding that's not the goal. The goal is to do it. I really believe in AI for good. So if you're doing facial recognition and that's not going to be used for good, or if you're denying loans and you're not, explaining why a loan was denied, I do think that those are very tricky outcomes for our society. So we really need to comprehensively think about it. So I really think this idea of skills, this idea of how do you staff up your team? How do you get organized around it? And what does that look like? And getting the right skills in the industry, that's absolutely key. People who really understand the space, people who really understand the problems to solve. They know the technology available to them on how to solve it and actually being able to sustainably support it. When you productize AI, you're just getting started. You have to maintain it.
This is really valuable because in the past, when we've said, hey, we're going to work on this new thing, whatever it is, you can kind of guess who should be on the team. You need to have a product person. You need to have a user experience person, an engineer, and maybe a marketing person or a salesperson who can act as a subject matter expert. That's not good enough for the AI space. So maybe for our listeners' benefit, you've talked about comprehensive skills. What's that cross-functional team look like to help ensure AI success?
I think it varies based on the size of the organization and the nature of the organization as well. But like you said, a skilled product person is absolutely essential who understands the entire landscape of what's going on, understand the problems being solved and the right technology to solve for it. You need a very skilled engineering team. You need a very skilled data scientist team, bringing in design thinking into the process, bringing in designers from the human experience and really delivering explainability and other good things about AI in a way that others can consume it easily and understand what AI is doing to them. But I think there should be a role for somebody to really define the governance framework. And that person should be responsible for writing down the values for the governance framework as well. Right. And I think that's a role that I haven't seen in the industry. I think that that's needed in the industry. Of course, you're going to have strategists, etc. I've worked in some very large organizations. I always had access to, amazing researchers, who were doing research around bias mitigation, for example. So it was easy to have access to a resource that would just explain that to you on how does bias occur in data, how do you mitigate it, how do you remove hate and profanity, how do you prevent AI from hallucinating. And I think if people don't have access to deep researchers who are doing that research, maybe the person who has the governance role can look in the industry and say, there's conversation around this that's important to our mission. We should understand it. And here are the tools that are addressing these in these different ways. But our values are, we are going to do all of these things.
So the governance role, so there's the initiatives, I think. So we just talked about the right kinds of skills you need on each team. The governance role presumably is at the portfolio level, the portfolio of initiatives. How do those move forward? What are the milestones? What's the work that you're asking the teams to do? Maybe even what do we work on in the first place? What gets into the funnel? And then funding mechanisms, go, no-go decisions. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of governance?
I think governance wouldn't include funding decisions. That's more of your AI strategy. What can you do? What's in your funding decision? I think governance is just defining people's skills, how they're organized, what are our values, and how are we going to deliver on those values as we deliver AI, right? It's more of that role for an organization. And it's a tricky role because, they have to understand skills, they have to understand the technology, they have to understand philosophy a little bit, and just say, this is how it's going to impact society, or be able to just look ahead into the future and saying, this is how it's going to impact and this is what we should do. And if you can't have a role like that, I think talking to the right people so that you're bringing that input into your AI initiatives, I think is going to be absolutely key.
So key, especially because the technology is changing weekly. There's something new every week where you think, oh, could I use that? Could we use this? I agree. Very pivotal role. Is there anything else that people should keep in mind when it comes to productizing AI?
I think being able to measure the accuracy of the model drift. Productizing AI means you have to manage the life cycle of the AI as well. You have to make sure that the false positives and false negatives continue to stay low. You have to make sure explainability is working the way you need it to work, that your model drift and model accuracy are within the right parameters. And if they're not, then you have to retrain your model. So you have to fine tune a large language model to say, this is what I need to say, and are you checking for, is my RAG really working or is my AI continuing to hallucinate? So those are the things that just managing the life cycle of AI.
So Meeta, we're getting close to the end of our time together. Could you maybe take us through a story where when you were productizing AI, it didn't turn out well? And then maybe the lessons learned from that. And then on the flip side, an example of productizing AI that went well and the lessons learned from that.
Two patterns that I learned on AI not going well, there's several, but two key ones, Ben. One was we did a project and we didn't really initially, didn't have the blessings of the lines of businesses. The data scientists and infrastructure team can build the best things out there, but if you don't have the line of business involved right from the start, it's very tricky to sell it to them. And it failed just because, they have other things that they have to think about, before AI gets productized. So I think that was a key lesson learned. And, the world doesn't understand that productizing AI, especially for mission critical regulated workloads, where data sovereignty, data regulations are important, is an extremely complex task. You're not just thinking about technology, right? You have to think about all of these other things, right? So that has led to failure when you don't think about all those things that you need to do. If you don't have trusted AI capabilities, that's really right out of the gate on most of the AI projects. On the flip side of that, the one pattern that I found to be very successful, where we learned a lot, was we were working in a country with several of the major banks to help stop fraud. I learned more about fraud than I ever wanted to. And it was very interesting because data that's extremely regulated data. That's extremely sensitive data. We created synthetic data sets to train the models, looking at just trends and patterns around fraud. rather than just looking at a specific institution's data. And then with that, when you train a model with synthetic data sets, it's actually reusable because there's nothing proprietary in it. And then those banks said, look, bank A is going to see certain fraud patterns and bank B is going to see similar fraud patterns the next day. Can we actually collectively use each other's wisdom to proactively prevent against these frauds? And then we were starting to have conversations with them on how to do that. How do you actually standardize how you talk about fraud, how you annotate fraud, how it's embedding in the synthetic data sets, and how everybody can get wisdom from it? That pattern of productizing fraud solution was able to score all their transactions, right? Because you have to do it so quickly, and was able to do it effectively with a low false positive rate, and was actually preemptively wise about what else was coming. And it was very interesting because they actually showed us that fraud is related to deadly violence. To them, it was a very ethical bank that started this work with us. One of the first things they told us, their goal was to reduce fraud because they said it's so detrimental to society.
Powerful. And just goes back to starting with the vision, knowing what problem you're trying to solve, and then trying to solve it. Sometimes with AI and sometimes without it, if it's not the best solution. So we are at the end of our time, unfortunately. So lightning round, if you could just share 3 things with your fellow corporate AI executives that would really help them to save time and money and build AI products, whether for external customers or internal users that really are adopted and generate a lot of value, what would they be?
One would, I would say, drown out the noise, step away from the hype, think about a sustainable strategy, look at the problems you want to solve. The second I would say is absolutely hire the best team that you can and bring the right people together because you need the right people. And third is, once you've planted your values, you've created your values, find the right technology to solve for that. And I think if they can solve for that, there's just a lot to keep up with. But thinking about these 3 things sustainably, I think should absolutely lead to success.
Simple and yet extremely powerful. I really appreciate your time, Meeta. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and looking forward to continue to hang out in the future.
Thanks, Ben. I love being here today.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Lean AI podcast. I hope you found my conversation with Meeta as insightful and inspiring as I did. Remember, the true power of AI lies not just in the technology, but as we talked about in this episode, in actually solving real human problems with AI. The Lean AI podcast is brought to you by Lean Startup Co. To find out more about our Lean AI approach to generating more AI wins with far less wasted time and investment, including our training workshops, pilot programs, and full implementation offerings, visit us at www.leanstartup.co. Search the Lean AI podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Lean Startup Co., thanks for listening and sharing with your colleagues and friends if you found this episode insightful.